And there's kind of a bunch of stuff on there. I sort of loosely follow the PowerPoints. I'm going to create some opportunities for us to ask, for you guys to ask questions and to lead the conversation a little bit, because there's a lot we can cover with this. So when I do kind of open it up for comments and questions, Guillermo, are you going to be coordinating the questions? Is that how it works?
Brett will be.
Brett will be. Okay, perfect. So I will share my screen now, and hopefully you will be able to see what I see. So is everyone able to see this? If you are, kind of nod your heads and we'll kind of look down.
Yes, you're good.
Good.
Looks
Okay.
good.
Okay, so obviously we talked about this in February. We did a first presentation on unhappy days and how to feel good even on a bad day. And we had a great reception at that point, just talking about some of these strategies of how to what is happiness and how to make ourselves happy. So as we continue to progress through this, one of the things that we talked about last time that we're going to talk about tonight is the idea of mental mastery, how to have a little bit of control over the way that our minds are working and over the way that our thoughts are working, and what to do when our thoughts are running away with each other. So this is a huge area. This mental mastery is a huge area. We're going to be talking about just a small piece of it tonight. And then I do want to hear your comments and questions, especially when it comes to things like how to deal with stressful situations. So the last time we did the presentation was in February. It was right before everything closed down. So I want to kind of create the context of that it's quite different now doing this presentation in the era of COVID-19. One of the things that we have really found is that a big barrier to happiness for many, many people is trying to find a way of staying connected while protecting ourselves and others. So as you know, I mean, this has just been going on in our community for a very long time. We need to find ways of feeling loved and also having physical touch and being held and supported, and really encouraging that sense and the feeling of belonging and the feeling that you are connected to a larger community in the midst of one of the most dangerous times in our history. So we start with the question, what is happiness? I always used to ask people this question, like, what is happiness? What does that actually mean to you? Most people have sort of vague ideas of what they think would make them happy and what makes them unhappy. So we start with just the idea of what is happiness? What do we think happiness really is? So point of clarification, there's a difference between emotions and moods. So when we talk about the idea of emotions, we're talking about the 6 basic emotions. Most of us know happy, mad, sad, afraid. And the guys who did most of the research on emotions in the 1970s, the mid and late 70s, Ekman and Friesen, they came up with the other 2 that are endemic to all cultures and all people, the idea of surprise and disgust. And the idea of basic emotions is that these are the things that were built in as babies, as infants, cross-culturally. These are sort of the emotional states that we as human beings feel. One of the things that I like to clarify is this idea that emotions are these sort of immediate internal and body reactions to external situations, and they're based on our thoughts and our beliefs and our past experience. So a lot of times our emotions, things that make us happy, things that we find enjoyable, are based a lot on our past experience, and they kind of build over time. So it can be really different for different people. I work with a lot of couples, and often in a relationship, something that will make one person happy will not really be that motivating for the other person. So a lot of it has to do with our past experience and our interpretation of the situation. Another point of clarification, those of you who are in recovery or who've been around the recovery community, A lot of times, the idea of shame is added as a basic emotion. So clearly, I've got some bold letters here. Shame is not a basic emotion. Shame is a mental construct that's based on these social and cultural and religious norms that affect our sense of self and our sense of well-being. But it's a construct. It's not endemic to all people, so it's not a basic emotion. There are people who grow up in cultures that don't really have a shame-based culture, and they don't have this sort of experience of shame. So one thing that is pretty inborn in us is this idea of self-consciousness or embarrassment. Those can be things that are pretty closely tied to just our genetic makeup. So the idea that a person is experiencing shame and that's a basic emotion is a little bit of a fallacy. So I think it's getting stuck. So emotions are transitory. So happiness, sadness, those kind of things are transitory. I love this quote at the bottom here where it says, "Laughter through tears is my favorite emotion," from Terms of Endearment. Those of us who are kind of old enough to remember that movie. The idea of emotions is that they come and go quickly, and often we have them in combinations. So we don't usually have, as human beings, a discrete emotion that happens by itself. It usually is a range of different emotional responses to situations that are happening in our life. Now, moods, on the other hand, are these persistent patterns of feelings that continue beyond one set of circumstances. So when we think about and talk about depressed mood, that's because sadness or a feeling of melancholy has lasted beyond the immediate situation and kind of occurs longer term. So that's kind of the clarification of these ideas. Moods are a state of mind. So what happens when we have a depressed mood or a sad mood or a happy and happiness is more of this idea of a state of mind over time. It's not about in the moment, it's about something that continues over a period of time. So happiness is not just an emotion, it's a state of mind. And when we try to think about what makes us happy and how do we achieve happiness, we want to think about things that are kind of going to have some longer term effects. So there's a lot of difference between happiness and pleasure. Pleasure tends to be this idea of, I'm sorry, the PowerPoint is doing a little backwards. Most of the things that bring us momentary pleasure actually make us unhappy in the long run. And I've given some of the examples on the slide. And most people are familiar and aware of this idea of happiness and pleasure are kind of different things. And pleasure in the moment doesn't necessarily lead to long-term happiness. So we want to try to think about what's going to make me overall more happy in my life? What's going to give me more happiness? Not just something that's going to make me pleasurable in the short term. So this idea comes from Laurie Santos. These are some quotes from her studies. We're pretty good at finding pleasure. We're not so good at finding happiness. So Laurie Santos, I'll talk a little bit more about her later on in the presentation. She created a class at Yale University, and then she also has something called the Happiness Lab, which is a podcast. And it's a fabulous kind of podcast to listen into because she's got a lot of great information about happiness and happiness research and about what actually gives us longer term happiness. So we'll be hearing more about her as we move through the presentation. But in the last 20 years, the happiness research has consistently shown that we actually are not very good at predicting the things that are going to make us happy. We think we know what they are, but we really, when you do the research and you really look at what makes people happy long term, we really don't have a great idea of it. We have a few sort of misconceptions. There's a study, and we're going to do a little bit more about this later on in the presentation, that people tend to overestimate how much a good experience is going to make them feel good, how much joy they're going to get, and how hard a bad experience is going to be on them and how sad that's going to be. And the truth is that actually both of these experiences dissipate over time, and the intensity of the feeling, both at the top end, the happy end, and sort of at the bottom end, the sad end, both of those tend to actually, we call regress toward the middle, regress toward the mean. Both of them actually kind of move into range. So the good news about it is that we actually have a lot of resilience when bad stuff happens, which is something that we are seeing right now a lot of. And it's actually been interesting, the studies that are being done on kids right now, because kids tend to be more outwardly visible with their feeling states. And so studying them in the era of COVID and homeschooling gives us a little bit more information about kind of what goes on in our own brains, and how resilient people really are. And also the areas that we're going to have trouble with. Initially, there was a big sensation, a big feeling that having kids stay at home and be at home school was going to create so much distress in them and so much anxiety. That has not borne out to be the case, which is good, that kids actually are far more resilient than we think they are. But it also does not bring them a lot more happiness to be at home all day long. So it actually is sort of pulling in. They're not as miserable as or unhappy as we thought they might be, but they're also not happy, and they're not feeling joy that they would feel because of the isolation. So what's the key to happiness? Now, most people really have an idea when they're younger of, if I get these things, I'm going to be happy. I did. I had this kind of idea of, I worked in the film industry, so if I'm a producer, I'm going to be happy. When I'm a director, I'm going to be happy. When I've made this great movie, I'm going to be happy. When I met Brett, I was actually doing an internship and still working in the film industry. So I kind of had my plan, which was the film industry. And then I was doing some work at the Gay and Lesbian Center in Los Angeles. And so part of the process was, I thought I knew the direction of my life that was going to make me happy. And what turned out was that my life took a different direction that was not exactly what I thought it was going to be, that actually ended up being the thing that was going to make me happy. And being in the area that I was in initially turned out to not bring me happiness, turned out to bring me a lot of discontentment. So part of what Laurie Santos talks about a lot on the podcast is that we're not that good at predicting it. And in the moment, we tend to underestimate how something new might make us feel happy because it doesn't match up or line up with a preconceived idea that we might have had. So I'm going to open this up a little bit. I'd like to hear from, if we were doing this in person, I'd be kind of throwing to the audience and want to hear a little bit from some of you of what makes you happy, what makes you unhappy. This will help to kind of guide our conversation a little bit. Brett, are you able to help coordinate the question answer piece?
Yeah, actually, most people can unmute yourself personally if you want to ask the question, or you can use the chat feature and we'll offer those up. But feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question of Dr. Gaetano.
Great, we're going to take like 5 to 10 minutes to kind of go through this, or 5 to 7 minutes.
Don't be afraid.
Don't be afraid, I don't bite.
We have one that says, when I see the mountains in the morning, red from the sun, I'm happy. From Robert.
Okay, excellent. Mountains in the morning, red. Oh, you know, that's so great. I love that too, Robert. You have to get up pretty early to see that one. It's right before the sun rises and it hits the mountains in above Palm Springs, and they're really red and orange. Yeah, I love that. And then as soon as the sun comes up a little bit more, it kind of dissipates. But I noticed that one morning when I was getting up, it's like, wow, that's great. That's wonderful. Yep. What else? What else makes us happy?
The lack of drama.
Okay, lack of drama.
Be appreciated for what I do.
We're going to talk about appreciation later. That's fantastic. The appreciation is really important.
Having a feeling of security in life.
Yep.
My dog makes me happy. Music can make me happy. Pool time, swimming, is my happy place. Thanks, Robert.
Yeah, swimming. I can't wait till the gyms to open again. Has anybody gone to the outdoor pool in Palm Springs? Is it at all warm? Because I'm a swimmer. Did you, Robert? Oh, good. Okay, because I think, oh my God, it must be freezing out there. But it's so nice during the day. That would be a great thing because swimming is wonderful, wonderful physical exercise and spiritual exercise.
My pool's too cold to go swimming in right now. I certainly haven't been to the public pool, but I don't expect it to be much better. But I don't know.
Yeah.
Finding
I would even try it
some kind of
though.
gratitude.
People talk about cold plunges, so I might even try it. Getting kind of desperate to get back in the water. What was the other one, Brett?
Well, I would say, let's say the pool is heated. It depends on what the wind is outside is the key.
Oh, there you go. Cool.
Finding some kind of gratitude is all I got. Mostly these days, I'm not very happy.
Gratitude, fantastic. Well, you kind of buried the lead because we are going to talk about gratitude. You're absolutely, we're going to talk about gratitude. And just in response to that, research on gratitude from several of the researchers I'm going to mention indicate it is the single most important thing that we can do to shift our mental and emotional state, is a sense of gratitude and some kind of gratitude practice. So I'm so happy you brought that up because it is really number one in terms of something that's simple that we can all do that's within our control that actually shifts our emotional state. So these are great.
Plays to the next one,
Wish we were
which is ultimately, says, ultimately, I believe that it's me who makes me happy rather than things or occurrences outside of me. Helping others, volunteering at the food bank makes me happy.
Absolutely great. So service, those of you who know about or know anyone who's in recovery, when they talk about service work as being a great way to kind of shift your mood, get yourself out of craving, and also feel that sense of contribution. I was looking at a video yesterday. It's a movie that came out, Tom Shadyac, who used to produce all the Jim Carrey movies, made a movie, is a documentary, I think it was 10 years ago, called I Am. And he talks about his journey, his personal journey from being a Hollywood producer and director to what ended up happening in his life, a tragedy that sort of turned him around. And he talks a lot about service work. His father was one of the main, father and Danny Thomas started the Children's Hospital, the St. Jude Children's Hospital. He talks about just how incredibly powerful service work is in helping to create a lasting sense of fulfillment. And it's interesting how some people don't make the distinction between fulfillment and happiness. So sometimes I think a little bit of it is, do we consider a sense of fulfillment to be I'm happy? So part of that I think is sort of an important piece. Do we consider happiness and fulfillment to be the same thing? Anyone else, Brett?
No, that was it.
Okay, great. So thank you. Thanks for sharing a little bit. Well, that guides a little bit of what we're going to be doing. So in a lot of the research that has been found, the obstruction to happiness is stress. It's actually the primary trigger for addiction as well. And it's also the primary trigger for a variety of different mental conditions. So when we think about bipolar and other kinds of mental conditions, depression, anxiety, stress is one of the primary triggers for it. And part of it has to do with how we actually perceive stress and what we do about stress. So I think that it's interesting that over many, many studies, that actually is one of the things that emerged in the research and there are two kinds of stress. We haven't, we'll talk about them a little bit, but there is positive stress called eustress, EU stress. And that's actually the kind of stress you get from doing something like running or hiking or something that challenges your body, bicycling, going on the AIDS ride, things like that, that are stressful in our bodies, but they are positive stress. exercise is an example of eustress. It stresses our body, especially like weight training, stresses our muscle, actually tears the muscle a little bit, creates these micro tears that actually heal up and keloid over and become how muscles build up. So there is a positive stress piece, and then there are things that are negative stress. Positive stress would fall in the category of things that feel challenging, but things that we choose to do. And negative stress, a lot of times negative stress has to do with things that are out of our control that are creating pressure on us. So I kind of make the distinction between challenge and pressure, that things that are challenging, but we're choosing to do them, can be and are very helpful and healthy for us. Now, this research has changed in the era of COVID. So since February, actually since last time we did this presentation, there's been a variety of different studies, some of them done locally by organizations like HARP and other organizations that are doing some of these phenomenological studies and finding out what's happened to all of us doing sort of lockdowns and social distancing. And obviously, I think you know where I'm headed with this. The main number one obstruction to happiness in the era of COVID is loneliness and isolation. It was always on the list. Stress kind of edged it out in all of the research studies. Loneliness and isolation were always on the list, but they have now risen in all of the happiness research to be the primary obstruction to happiness, is this idea of loneliness and isolation, a lack of meaningful connection to family and friends and a supportive social group, let alone romantic partners. So one of the things that is really an important kind of predicate of this is that as human beings, connection is not optional. There are people who don't have a big need for connection, so it varies. Not everybody has the same need for connection and for bonding and for community, but in general, genetically, we are all completely predisposed to need to connect through our attachment. There's an attachment impulse that's part of the way we're built innately. Also, we are social animals, and we bond together for a lot of survival needs. So connection to others is the most important thing. Isolation can be very devastating. And the biggest thing we've learned from COVID is that connection is so important, and we have to work at ways to keep that connection going. I have, being in this industry, as a lot of you are, and obviously my friend Brett is as well, we are connected to people who are both frontline, responders and healthcare workers. And, one of the things that all of my friends who work in this industry say repeatedly is that it's fascinating how innovative families are trying to be to keep connected to loved ones in nursing homes, to loved ones that are isolated in apartments that are kind of self-quarantining. So it is a really fascinating time that we are trying to, and even this portal, how many of us wish we had stock in Zoom? Anyone else? It's like, good Lord, what was I thinking? But blasted on the scene in February, this idea of telemedicine and telecommunication as being one of the primary ways of keeping us connected, FaceTime and all of the other internet sources. So in a way, I had talked to, early on, it was probably March, and right before my birthday in March, I had the opportunity to talk to a woman who was 97. And she actually grew up with people who were in the swine flu pandemic. So she actually had aunts and uncles that had survived that. And so one of the things that was fascinating when you're talking to somebody from that had that experience of not only that, but the Great Depression and the stock market crash and Pearl Harbor. One of the things that's fascinating is that she said the savior of people in the modern era is telecommunication. That she gave the example that I thought was really fascinating, that she was living in California during Pearl Harbor, when Pearl Harbor happened. And they didn't hear about it for 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor had actually happened, is when they finally heard about it. And the reason they heard about it, she lived up in Bakersfield, was that they were starting to put Japanese Americans into concentration camps throughout California, which we know has happened here. That's the only reason they heard that there had been an attack. 2 weeks later. Now, she said, when I asked her some of the things that in her lifetime that were devastating, she said 9/11 was one of the most devastating things she'd ever experienced because she actually saw it in real time. So one of the things about telecommunication that is wonderful is that it does keep us connected. The other thing that is stressful in a negative way is that it actually is so constant and in our face and relentless that it can be a source of stress and unhappiness. That constant watching the news and constant bombardment with the media can actually be a primary, it's like social media can be a wonderful way to keep connected, and yet also can be the source of a lot of stress. I have worked with, I don't so much anymore, but I have worked with teenagers who were talking about social media bullying, and that because I worked with LGBT youth. And it's profound. It can be very profound, especially in the transgender community. So it's this duality of things that can be wonderful and can bring us happiness, can also bring us lots of sadness and stress. And this is the point where I would ask people in the audience if you had any questions. So please, if you do have a comment that you'd like to make about any of this, I would love to hear it. So this is just sort of our last, and a lot of these I wrote out because doing telemedicine, or teleconferencing, I want you to be able to kind of read this without having to do the captioning underneath. But for us in the LGBT community, we've experienced this kind of dilemma of connection and isolation many times. And so part of it is that we want to really be clear that, the majority of our lives, we've had this understanding there's an inherent need for all of us to have physical contact. And it's often far outweighs the many risks that can accompany physical connection. So right now, I hear many, many people that are really struggling with this. How do I have connection? How do I get hugs? How do I stay connected? How do I have sex safely? How do I share love safely? So it's going to be an ongoing question. I'd like to open it up right now, Brett, for just a few comments. If there's anyone who'd like to make a comment about it, doesn't have to be a question. You can actually just make a personal comment if you'd like to comment on some of the things we're talking about.
Absolutely. So again, feel free to use the chat and I can say it, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask or share your thought as well.
And you'll see, in this slide, I'm basically just continuing to say what we know to be true, to kind of keep reaffirming what we know to be true. We have to continue to outweigh fear with knowledge, as we had to do throughout the pandemic, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, throughout all of the problems with breast cancer and other kinds of cancers that have been affecting our community, through discrimination, through homophobia. We have to continue to use those as tools to help us create that sense of security. I love that, when somebody said earlier, this idea of security is something that brings happiness. Absolutely. And it's hard to feel secure when you feel that you're under a lot of threat. The lack of appreciation also as being something that can make you feel unhappy. And being able to appreciate each other, even if we're not able to do it in person, so important, so incredibly important. So the science of well-being and happiness, it's usually sometimes called positive psychology. If you're interested in it, there's tons of stuff on the internet about it, tons of stuff on YouTube. It's kind of hard to kind of sift through all of it, but there's a lot of great stuff out there on the science of well-being and happiness. And what's really interesting is that, I used to teach college level for MFTs and MFTIs, so people that were going into therapy to be a counseling degree. And one of the things that happened when they started doing the research on happiness and well-being, and they started reading the articles and looking at the YouTube videos, they actually reported that they just kind of felt happier overall. Not necessarily within my class, but just the idea of reading these stories and looking at the videos and increase their level of happiness. And of course, that's one of the things that Laurie Santos talks about in her class and also on her happiness lab. So everyone has this particular set point, which is actually the interesting thing about happiness. If you look back in your family, you know, they used to call it melancholy. What was the other thing they used to call depression? I can't remember now. But it was this idea that before we actually had the term depression, we would talk about this, oh, melancholy, she's just sort of a dour person. So we had this idea that there are people that we knew that weren't happy, but we didn't really know why. And there wasn't a lot of stuff that sort of made them happy. So there was tons of research, most of it was done on twins, about what makes one person happy and another person not happy, especially in the same situation. And the work on identical twins was very revealing because they have so much, they have 99.5% the same genetic makeup as identical twins. So you would think they would respond to the environment in the same way and have the same sort of happiness set range. But turns out they kind of didn't. So 50%, this is actually good news. So 50% is genetic, sort of our happiness range. And it kind of runs in families. People can be happy. My dad was happy, my mom was happy, or sadness, depression, anxiety, run through families. Not a surprise, we kind of know that especially if you grow up with a sad person, your range tends to be reflective of their range a little bit. So that part we kind of knew about. But only 10% of our happiness range is determined by life circumstances. Only 10%. By age, by income, by social status, by culture, religion, by other circumstances that happen to us, including bad things that happen to us. Only 10% of our overall happiness set range is that. The other 40% is intentional activities that we are choosing to do. 40%. That's great news, because what that means is that even if you kind of grow up in a sad family or the family's very flat or your set point is very flat, there's still an opportunity that you can grow and develop. I don't have the research, but there was, and it was posted. They did happiness research. They actually interviewed newscasters, and they interviewed ones that we would know, like Gail Ting, and I forget who the other ones were. It was very fascinating to determine kind of which ones were sort of had a happiness set point and sort of what made them go into to broadcast news. And it was fascinating. Uniformly, broadcast newscasters had the lowest genetic set point for happiness. They just kind of, and it was sort of like they chose the field because they actually had a pretty high tolerance for negative experiences. Not surprisingly, and mostly cliche, sportscasters and weathermen had the highest set point for happiness. And that's why they kind of add a little lightness to the newscast. So the idea of this that I think is really helpful is that when we start thinking, wow, I'm just a sad person and I'm never going to be happy, 40% of our overall happiness range is determined by actually things we choose to do. So I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. We've known this before. 2 kinds of happiness. Hedonic happiness is this seeking current pleasure, and authentic happiness is this idea of something that's lasting and meaningful. And we actually need both types in really different qualities. And we actually sort of need more authentic happiness than we do this current pleasure. Current pleasure is a little easier to get. My addiction is food. Everybody else in my family, most people in my family have food addiction. My older brother was a heroin addict and alcoholic. So he kind of went in a different direction. But it's fascinating when we sort of look at the set point of happiness in my family. The things that made us happy, because we're all food addicts, were dinners and food and social gatherings and those kind of things. So when I think about my happiest memories, they're actually connected to those kind of activities, which were voluntary activities that were sort of informed by that. Now, when I look at it too, it's like, as a person trying to sort of register and regulate my weight, I feel a sense of sadness when I can't participate in those. So I have to make other choices that are going to give me some current pleasure to replace the pleasure I got out of things like food. And of course, the corollary to that is addicts and people who are addicted to drugs or alcohol have to kind of do the same thing. So let me move through. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. So you guys mentioned gratitude, which is just like amazing. And the perception and gratitude are the two keys to happiness. So being able to acknowledge and focus on positive experiences and the positive aspects of a situation, as I said earlier, is the most important, significant thing we can do to change our mental state, even in the midst of pretty horrific things. So I did HIV pre and post-test counseling for 12 years at the LA Gay and Lesbian Center. And I started doing it at the beginning of the pandemic. And when I was giving people their HIV test results, it was at that time when I first started doing it, we only had AZT as a medication. So very powerful kind of time, because people's perception of their health and wellness and perception of that event actually had a lot of bearing on how well they did and how long they lived. So I had a slide in here, but it was really too grainy. You couldn't see, but there was a study that was done with long-term survivors of cancer and HIV, of what were the qualities and different characteristics of those people and what did they do. And it was really pretty extraordinary, the kinds of things that they did that we now take for granted. These are things that we know, and gratitude was hugely high on the list. You know, and gratitude, I kind of have the explanation here. Gratitude is being able to acknowledge and focus on the positive of a situation, the positive aspect of a situation, and that sense of being grateful for having those things in our life. So Martin Seligman, if you guys are interested, I can leave this up for a few minutes. You can write some of these little links down. There's a couple of YouTube links. So he's the guy who did a ton of stuff on positive psychology and happiness. So if you want to do a little bit of your own research, you can kind of do that and see some of his videos. He kind of did this, he's done a lot of studies, but there was one of the things that he determined when he started doing positive psychology. First of all of his colleagues just sort of like shamed him for doing something on positive psychology because they thought it was just dumb. And so at the time he started, he said there were 100 studies on negative psychology and there'd be only one on positive psychology and resilience. So it wasn't a very popular field because we were more interested in what was wrong with people than what was right with them, which I think is a fascinating viewpoint of psychology in general. So I'm going to leave this up for a few minutes. These are the keys to happiness number 2. So he uses the acronym PERMA. And here it is: positive emotion, engagement not only in an activity. He referred to it in the sort of in the zone and flow. I don't know if any of you, most of us probably understand and remember in the 80s, an author named Csikszentmihalyi wrote a book called Flow, and it became like the big thing in all of our industries. Being in flow, being in the zone. So engagement in an activity that actually makes you feel really fully engaged. I'm a swimmer, I was a diver. You know, when you're really in the zone and you're really doing those activities, bicycle riding, hiking, anything that really can get you piano, you know, playing the piano, singing, enjoying music. Those are the kind of things. Obviously, relationships are on here. He adds this crucial point, which is about perception, noble purpose, belonging to something bigger than ourselves, this idea of the meaning that we give to activities. That would also include sort of service work. And then a sense of accomplishment is really important. So we don't want to make it seem like having a great job and buying a wonderful house and getting the things that we desire, that's bad. It's not. It creates this, obviously, this sense of accomplishment that actually can determine some of our long-term happiness. So I want to open it up again, Brett, if you don't mind, kind of letting us know how people are responding to this idea and some of these guidelines and some of these ideas.
Okay, so nothing in the chat, but feel free again, everyone, please do not hesitate to unmute yourself or use the chat feature to ask a question or tell us how you're feeling.
If we were in person, I'd be calling on people by now. So y'all are kind of lucky because we usually just go up, stand next to somebody and just sort of ask them what they think. So, so Brett, do you have an
I
idea
get the
about this?
anxiety.
Yeah. So I'm
Yeah,
gonna
I mean,
call on
mine
Brett.
is, I mean,
Tell me what you think about
I
this.
get the anxiety. Yeah, no, I mean, I just get, you go through, there's different people around me in the workplace, in my day-to-day life that are, many people who are retiring way early because they're just tired of, everything that's happening in our world of today. And so they're able to, but it's, and that's those kind of pieces, I'm happy for them, but it's made additional anxiety for me. That it's just, I know it's there and I know that's what's kind of causing it, but I don't want to dampen their excitement.
Mhm.
But, just people are making all kinds of unique choices, to find their happiness.
Yeah. Yeah. And you bring up a good point. I kind of skipped over it early. I think it's really important that we are able to acknowledge exactly where we're at and what we're feeling and not shame ourselves for not feeling good. So, one of the things that definitely happens is that there's this perception that um, I should be a happy person. I'm a psychologist. So, people who know me are like, oh, yeah, you should be happy. You got all these tools and you're a therapist, do this for a living. Why are you upset? And I'm like, because shit happens, because stuff sucks, because I'm a human being. And it's okay to say, here's where I'm at, to go to your friends and say, I'm having a crappy day. So part of it is that, when we move into the happiness research, one of the main things that was a part of overall happiness was the ability to actually acknowledge exactly where you're at in the moment and be okay with, yeah, today I'm just not feeling good. I worked with a lot of long-term survivors and people who did not survive um, critical illnesses and terminal illnesses. And it's really fascinating, the idea of having to live one day at a time and having to be okay with having really crappy days, having to be okay with today's just not a good day, and loving and honoring yourself through that and being able to really understand that it's okay to not have a good day. It's okay to be where you're at. Sadness is okay. We tend to
We have a couple
preference
things.
happiness. Go ahead. Yeah, Brett.
Yeah, a couple things that have come through. It says, what if you don't feel entitled to happiness, or you can't feel worthy of happiness is one. Um, and then can you elaborate on engagement in flow in the zone? That's a separate kind of thing. But the whole idea of entitlement of happiness is, I have friends who feel very much that same way.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think it's a great question, and I think the reason I think it's a great question is because, um, and this actually is borne out in the research. It's called an upper limits problem, especially it was part of the executive research that was being done about why people reach ceilings in their jobs or why people reach sort of thresholds in certain situations in sports, and also why people sabotage relationships. And it's this idea of there's sort of this upper limits problem where it's like, I'm really comfortable at this level of unhappiness, or not because it's kind of what I think I deserve, or what I kind of felt like I deserved because the messages I got as a kid were that I really didn't deserve much, and sometimes if you grow up with a parent, let me talk with my hands like an Italian to the screen. Um, if you grow up with a parent who's unhappy, like my grandmother was an unhappy person. She was a very depressed person all my childhood. So I remember when we were around her as kids, we used to be really afraid to be happy around her. Like she would walk in the room. Perfect example, those of you who are my age, we were watching the Munsters on TV. And the Munsters was followed by the Addams Family. So a typical kid night in like the late 60s. And grandma would walk in the room and we would turn off the TV because we didn't want to laugh in front of her, because we felt guilty feeling happy in front of her. And what that did is it set up in a lot of us this feeling of not being entitled to or feeling worthy to actually feel good. So it's a fabulous question, because sometimes we don't know we've got that going on until we start doing a little bit of self-reflection and say, why do I push away things that are good for me? Why do I push away situations? Why don't I get up and dance? You know, I saw a movie last night. For any of you who are watching the Hallmark Channel, the LGBT community has now taken over some of the Hallmark Channel. They've got a Christmas movie that's sort of based loosely on Brokeback Mountain, only nobody dies, so it's a good one. And then they had a lesbian couple in one of their movies. So, you know, I'm watching these movies, and it's kind of like, wow, if I had seen these movies 20 years ago, how would I have felt about seeking out a same-sex partner? How would I have felt about being in my relationships? Would that have helped me feel more entitled to be happy as a gay man? So I think the question is incredibly, incredibly important. What if we don't feel worthy of being happy? One of the answers that I would have to it, I'd recommend to it, is that we can track where that comes from, because it didn't start with us. It was something that was laid on top of us. It wasn't something, because internally we are hardwired with happiness. There's a great book actually called Hardwired for Happiness. But there is a lot of research that says that infants come into the world with their own constitution, but they are hardwired to actually experience happiness and joy. So we have to be taught not to do it. We have to be taught that it's not okay. We have to be taught that it's dangerous. And if we can be taught that, we can unteach it. We can be taught. So part of it is this idea of incrementalism, that we have to take our sort of zone of happiness and gradually just expand it. Where it's uncomfortable to be happy. It's uncomfortable to be in a situation where people are laughing. We expand it just a little bit out of our comfort zone of, I'm going to go, because I'm not really great at sort of big social events, but I'm going to go to this social event and I'll stay for 20 minutes, because that's sort of my comfort zone of being around 100 people pre-COVID. So I'd stay for 20 minutes, talk to a couple of people. I know people who love those events, there for hours, talk to 100 people. Kind of not me. But it was interesting, if I allowed myself to just expand out just a little bit, a little more socialization, a little more connection, I actually kind of felt this thing of, wow, okay, that's good. So the big question we have about worthiness and happiness is like, and we just ask it to ourselves, why am I not worthy of being happy? And see what answer we come up with. And like I said, the first thing came to mind when you asked the question, because I asked it to myself, is because it was not nice to do that in front of grandma. So I was codependent with my grandmother because we were kids. So it's like, oh yeah, I don't want to make grandma feel uncomfortable because I'm happy. So you learn to don't be too happy around her. Interesting that I'm 60 years old, still got that message. My grandma's been dead for 35 years, still got that message. So a lot of these lessons we can undo, they're in there. So the other thing we talked about with flow, it's so fascinating because everybody has had the experience of it. When Csikszentmihalyi was doing all of his research and writing his books about it, he actually said it is the most common experience of human beings. They just don't necessarily recognize it, but everybody has this experience of doing something where they feel like it's kind of effortless and I'm really enjoying it. He was talking to this, and there's a video about this online, wish I had it. He was talking to these Amish women who were in a, I guess it's a sewing circle, I guess they were making a quilt. What do they call that, a quilting circle? Who were making these quilts in sort of the Amish country in the East. And they were sitting around and he was sort of talking to them and asking them their experience. And they were doing this for like hours. And all of them said routinely, it's like, sometimes we lose track of time because it's just such a wonderful thing we're engaged with. We feel like we are part of the quilt that we are making. That's the experience, that you feel like you're sort of part of it. When I'm swimming, sometimes I just am flowing through the water. A lot of times not, but sometimes flowing through the water. When I used to dive, the diving was going really well. And you just feel like, wow, I'm really in it. The great news about the engagement thing is that once we've had an experience of it, we can use it as a reference point to come back to. And that was what his whole thing was, is that the more often we feel that sense of connection with ourselves. Engagement is really about this idea of I'm so connected with myself and what I'm doing that it's sort of effortless. And it can be work, it can be play, it can be lovemaking, it can be anything. So a lot of people that he interviewed said that the only time they actually sort of experienced that, where their attention and focus is completely on the activity, was in periods like when they're making love, because it was such a powerful experience that it really captured all of their attention. Was there anything I missed, Brett? Was there another one? Worthy of happiness and flow? Was there another one I missed?
You kind of covered it. It was really, whoops, there's another one coming in. It says, what if you don't want to show happiness because a lot of people around you feel unhappy? And you were talking about that with your grandmother.
Yeah. And it's,
and the other one,
yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead, Brett.
Can anyone tell me what the Palm Springs pool outdoor, presumably outdoor pool was discussed at the opening? It's the one that's right there. The Palm Springs pool is a city-owned pool that's right next to the library and the ball field, right on Baristo and kind of between Baristo and Ramon and Sunrise. And the pool is heated, and it's a city public, city pool. So
it's like $2.
How do you get in
something?
Yeah. How do you get in flow if you have a hard? The chat keeps moving. How do you get in flow if you have a hard time being in flow?
Well, it's interesting. The first thing that he said about flow was that a lot of times we stumble into it. And so the first thing is to acknowledge those moments when you have felt it, because you're more likely to repeat it if you actually acknowledge it. And so the first research he did, which was fascinating, because I used to work with professional athletes when I was working at Moonview, is that he actually asked professional athletes, like, what did it feel like? And how do you know you're in flow? And I used to ask all the athletes I worked with was, what was your routine for getting yourself into the zone? And it's fascinating because a lot of them didn't have it. They didn't really know. They didn't have a system for getting themselves into flow. And so part of our work that I'd done with them was, let's develop a system so you can, because you weren't just a high school athlete now, you're a college athlete or a pro, and you're expected to do this on demand. Not surprisingly, actors and performers who've taken a lot of acting classes learn how to do this. They learn how to get into the character. They call it getting into character, but actually that's flow. Get into it, stay into it, be embodied into it 5 nights a week and twice on Saturday. So it is one of those things that is really powerful, that once you notice it and recognize it, you can repeat it over and over again. And the comment earlier too about, it is really hard right now to feel happy when so many people are sad. And so it is difficult to actually feel happy and to be happy. So one of the things that's recommended, and we kind of can just try it, is that it's the idea of ramping up. You come in smooth into a situation and try to sort of match the emotional tenor of the situation, and then gradually raise it as you're in it. Not coming in, because it's the contrast, and it was for my grandmother, the contrast that was so jarring to be, if you're really, really sad, and any of you have had experiences of being really depressed in your life, or had a lot of really incredible loss, when you've experienced a lot of grief, and then you walk outside and people are laughing and people are happy, it's that contrast that's very, very jarring. The discontinuity between what I'm experiencing inside and what's going on out there is really hard. So the idea of ramping up, being with people who can let you be exactly where you're at, and then gradually increasing the positive sort of situations that you engage in to your comfort level. Raising that, kind of breaking that level out a little bit, can be really helpful. So the positive psychology exercise from Martin Seligman, this is a kind of a good one that we try to recommend. And since we're getting really close to time, we're probably going to end up ending with the next slide, which I'll give you, that has the happiness lab. But this is a good one for every night for the next week. Write down 3 things that went well today and why they went well. Just 3 things that went well. Recognizing, focusing on the things that happened. They don't have to be huge things. Just what were the 3 things that went well today? And why did they go well? The next piece, I'll leave this up for a minute. I'm actually going to come back to it, but I want to leave this up at the end so you guys could kind of go to this happiness lab thing. But these are the tips that she came up with in all of her research and that she used in her class that I think is really useful to sort of have this this idea that, you know, sleeping, exercise, it's stuff we know. Play more, take some free time. She refers to it as time affluence, to not have your life so full that you don't have free time. Connecting with partners and friends and families, and saying yes to social connections and pro-social behavior. Things like volunteering at food bank earlier. Somebody said, you know, volunteering with the food, fantastic. It's pro-social behavior, it's contribution, it's connection to other people. It gives you a sense of belonging. And then this is kind of where we started with the idea of gratitude. Compassion and gratitude lead to happiness. And I love what Jim Quick, you can see a bunch of his stuff online too, is that, you know, happiness is a skill that we have to practice. It's kind of a muscle. It's a skill that we practice through acts of kindness. And I didn't grow up with people who are very happy. I grew up with post-Depression era Italian immigrants, not very happy people. They had fulfillment, so I took that as being sort of happiness. But I had to learn how to be happy, how to kind of do things that felt joyful. And acts of kindness is kind of the inroad to that. If you have a chance to look at any of Jim Quick's stuff, if you like life coaching kind of people, he's a great life coach online. He's got tons of stuff. And I love this line of his: don't give up your sovereignty over your day and your mood to your electronics. When we get up first thing in the morning and we check our phone, we're constantly checking our phone. He says we give up our sovereignty over our own life and mood to our electronics. So let me see.
Gaetano, we have we're at hour, but we do have a hard stop at 6:45 because we have another session that's going to start right at 7.
Mm-hmm.
But I do have Andrew who raised his hand. And Andrew, did you want to unmute yourself? There you go. Ask the question.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about long-term HIV survivors, because I am one, and I am primarily a negative person, and feel like you have a similar background to yours of a lot of unhappiness and just kind of dreariness, struggle. But I'm not, you know, one can never know why we survive or not, but I don't think of myself as particularly a happy person, but I think a lot of it was just my personal stubbornness on my part. And I don't know how that relates, but
it does, yeah.
But I think that's what I perceive in terms of my own experience. But I do have a hard time finding things to be happy about. I feel secure in my life. You know, I have a home and a roof over my head and financially secure, but I still find hard to find happiness out in the world. And this pandemic time has been much more difficult to feel so aimless in the time.
Yeah, and it's interesting because what you call stubbornness, we in psychology would call resilience. You know, the willingness to keep fighting for and not give in and not give up. You know, I mean, there was a researcher that wrote several books, Norman Cousins, and the Norman Cousins Psychoneuroimmunology Clinic in Los Angeles was sort of started after his accidental research on what were the things that you do emotionally that create this neurological shift. And And so the PNI Institute they put together the list that I was referring to of these things that long-term survivors did and had in common. And there were a variety of things, and things like resilience and persistence. And it's really kind of an important thing. There are 14 of them. If you don't mind me scrolling through my computer, I might be able to find them. But I wanted to leave this up so you guys could make the jump to Laurie Santos. But I think what you're describing, also that willingness to kind of just keep persevering, that's a very powerful thing. The other thing I want to leave us with too is this idea that we don't want to be comparing our happiness set point and our experience of happiness to other people and saying, I'm not a happy person because I don't do happiness the way they do it, especially when you're in a couple, in a relationship. I don't do happiness the way they do it. Or sometimes we will say that to each other in a relationship and say, you're just an unhappy person, or you're not a happy person. I'm just a happy person. So that's a trap when we start doing this comparison back and forth of I'm not as happy, because we all experience it differently. I love what you said about security. Security can make a person feel calm. And so that actually can be a quality of happiness. I don't have the big ecstasy, happy, la. I don't have those experiences very often as an adult. Had a bunch of them as a kid. Haven't had a lot of them as an adult. Have the big silly experiences where you just feel outrageously happy. But that's okay. I think part of it is not judging the phase of life we're in and saying, I'm not a happy person because I'm not experiencing the way I used to or the way that other people do. The first thing is about what am I experiencing, and being grateful. I mean, I do the gratitude thing. I have it up on my mirror, so I look at it every day because I'm a psychologist, so I do mirror work, and I really do. I recite it. I'm happy and grateful for the wonderful things in my life. Today, I express gratitude for the wonderful things in my life, and then kind of just take a minute to see if I can list them out. It does work. So, but I think it's very powerful, this idea of people survive and thrive as a result of many things, not just the pursuit of joy, but also sometimes it's the unwillingness to give up or to give in. And long-term survivors are resilient people. 35 years later, we're finally in the place where Jeff Taylor and the HARP group are looking at some of the resilient cure research, the RID research, which is a very powerful idea that 35 years later we may have something that's a cure for the HIV virus. But when we didn't have that, when people just had their mind and the power of their social group to deal with, same thing, my friend Betsy Haas in Los Angeles, and she dealt with breast cancer twice. And she's like, all she had was her mind and her spirituality and her resilience and her unwillingness to give up and unwillingness to give in. And that's what made her a long-term survivor. So I think that we don't want to underestimate the power of that. Even if it doesn't look like happiness, it can be fulfilling. Brett, are you there?
I'm here, and we're at time, Gaetano,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
so I thought we were probably at time. I wanted to make sure I was respectful of our time. So,
Oh, you have another, yeah.
On a totally trivial note, the Dolly Parton quote is from Steel Magnolias, not Terms of Endearment.
Oh, was it Steel Magnolias? Oh, okay.
Shirley MacLaine was in both, but Dolly Parton wasn't in Terms of Endearment.
Oh, you're right. I'm so sorry. Yep. Oh, my gay card is really on the line here. Shit. I'm going to have to
Oh my God, I love gay men. I love gay men. They know where the coats come from.
I know, it's so great. We invented most of them. Half of them
I had to check IMDb, but I knew Dolly Parton wasn't in Terms of Endearment.
You're so right. Yes. Steel Magnolias. Yes. Laughter through tears is my favorite emotion. So,
Gaetano, you're getting a lot of good feedback for your lecture.
Yes,
Nothing has been the most illuminating and helpful.
Thank you so much. And if we have a vehicle to do it, I'm happy to pull up that slide. I did find it in my other presentation on the characteristics of long-term survivors. If someone is interested in that, I can certainly forward it to the facilitators and they can pass that around.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you can
do,
send it to me, Gaetano, and I can send to the emails to everybody
Oh,
who has
perfect.
registered.
Yeah, perfect.
Yep. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for a great presentation, Gaetano, and for everybody's participation. And we'll, if we can coerce him enough, maybe we can get him back in Q1 or something as well, and maybe speak on another topic similar.
Or just do the rest of my
Candice,
slide deck on this one.
Candice,
All right,
Candice
everyone.
out.
Thank you so much.
What,
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
what are you saying?
Have a
Guillermo?
wonderful holiday, everybody.
Yes, and
Are
stay
you
safe,
talking,
everyone.
Guillermo?
Stay away from people this holiday.